Welcome to our office hours, everybody. Please make sure to put your information in the chat as we go. Love to know who's here. All right, so I am going to start us off today, and people can keep coming in as we go. I'm going to give a brief overview on the Ability Challenge, and then I'm going to turn it over to Kristen. I am Sarah Sandelius. I am the CEO of the Ability Challenge. And we are offering these office hour sessions monthly with topics that are aligned to different topics of relevance to our community. We'll talk a little bit more about why we started to do the office hours in a minute. But today we're really focusing on specially design instruction. So ABC, or the Ability Challenge, we use a research-based program. We have a research-based program that develops critical core competencies in school leaders, educators, and support staff so that they will be empowered to create authentically inclusive school communities and teams that work together to meet the unique needs of all learners. And ultimately, the goal of that is to transform how students with disabilities are served in their school. So our work is really focused around that middle bullet of creating authentically inclusive school communities and teams that can meet the unique needs of all learners. And we start with what that looks like for students with disabilities. And so our work is really about putting the needs of students with disabilities at the center of policies, procedures, and systems at the school level. Kristen, next slide. We have a big goal, which is by 2045, we want to make sure that 1 million more students with disabilities are on track to graduate from school, ready to thrive and empowered to take on the world. There are between 7.5 and 10 million students with disabilities, depending on how you count them. And right now, depending on where you are regionally in the US, the outcomes for students with disabilities are stark. And COVID has really put that front and center. And so what we aim to do is to work with schools to make sure that they are providing environments that are conducive to learning and are welcoming in terms of culture and inclusive, so that 1 million more students are ready to take on the world. That's sort of the big picture of the Ability Challenge. Kristen's going to talk a little bit more about the office hours series, so take it away.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Kristen Briggs. I'm the Managing Director of Program. So as Sarah mentioned, she talked to you about how we approach the work overall. And the office hours series is really born out of two main factors that came up in our work. One is, as an organization, ABC is in a period of growth, and we are learning a lot from our work in the field with partners. As we do, a number of areas of interest are emerging that align with the work that we do and the resources that we provide. And there are new and different needs that are facing schools and districts as a result of all this change that we're living through. And so we recognize that there are a lot of tools out there, but we know that there's a unique opportunity for us to share what we're learning in real time to get more resources and tools out there that are like proven, if you will. So we want to be able to share the lessons we're learning with like practical, actionable resources that folks can use. And so Office Hours is designed as a companion to our monthly blog, where we share a bit more context about the focus of the month, and we actually share the tool. So this month, we are really excited to dig into our specially designed instruction planning tool. As we continue to work with partners and learn more from the field, we're going to continue to put out resources that are really relevant and helpful. And we encourage you, please also share with us as you are engaging in the work, like what would be really helpful to see, what questions do you have, what topics are of interest, and we will make sure to dig into those things. So before we introduce the tool, we talk through the decision tree, we first want to start with a common definition. So when we talk about specially designed instruction, we're really leaning into the definition as outlined in IDEA, which says that SDI is adapting as appropriate to the needs of an eligible child under IDEA, the content, methodology, or delivery of instruction. One, to address the unique needs of a child that result from the child's disability, and two, to ensure access of the child to the general curriculum. We emphasize that second point because it's exceptionally important. It's not just about meeting the needs of a student and removing the barriers for that their disability can contribute to, but also like making sure that they have access to the general curriculum. So at its core, we like to think of SDI as exceptionally strong teaching that is individualized for different types of learners. As we go also, like, please feel free to use the chat feature to drop any questions, pop on your mic if anything comes up as we move through the session. So when we talk about implementing SDI, there are really like three core ways that you approach it. In some worlds, there's a fourth, and I'll talk through that quickly. So SDI can include strategies or methods of differentiation, accommodations, modifications, but again, done with a specific intentional focus of removing barriers of a student's disability to grant them access to that core curriculum. SDI can and ultimately should really fade over time as a student moves through school, as they progress through, secondary and post-secondary options, with the ultimate goal being students learning how to implement those elements on their own to gain access to not only the general education curriculum, but really to the world at large. SDI can be provided via adaptations to content, process, or product, and in some cases, environment. So when we talk about content, that is really what is taught. And so that question is, how will the student access the grade level general education curriculum? We like to give a caveat here, we give a little asterisk, and here's why. This should apply to less than 10% of students receiving special education services. Content is drastically changing whatever that general education curriculum is, which again, if we think back to that definition from IDEA, the point of SDI is to give students access to the general education curriculum. So if a child requires a content modification, they are more likely to be a student who has a more significant need. And so we need to keep that in mind when we're thinking about content modifications.
And I'll just jump in for a second. I think this is one of the things that is most frequently misunderstood about special education, which is that special education needs to provide some level of lessening the standards or lowering the standards or lowering the amount of content that's being taught because a student is behind. And I think that what we're trying to get across through bringing this topic up a lot and also through the tool is that in reality, most of what you're doing is you're accommodating the lesson to make sure that it is accessible rather than changing the content of the lesson, because a child ultimately needs that content, right? So really effective SDI is looking at the lesson and providing access to that content, but it's also about building the skills that a child might be missing to sort of make sure that they are able to then build in those missing pieces so that when they do access gen ed content, they have the skills that they need in order to really move forward.
Sarah, we had a really good question come up in the chat that I think fits with what you're describing. And it's, but when I change questions, isn't that a content modification for my students? That is a very good question. Do you want to tackle it first? You want me to?
Go for it.
Okay. So that's a very good question. And it's tough without knowing what is being changed in the question, right? So if a student is being asked a question, for example, like a higher level of depth of knowledge, right? That requires a different demonstration of knowledge. And that is changed drastically. So like, instead of analyze these two texts to compare and contrast character development, it's retell the beginning, middle, and end of the story. That is a modification, and that changes what that student is accessing in terms of grade level curriculum. If it's the case that a student is still responsible for that question, but there are 2 or 3 stair-step questions, if you will, that get them to that place, that is not you are not modifying the end goal of holding them accountable to the general education curriculum. It's putting supports in place to help them think through the scaffolded steps in order to be prepared to answer that question. Can you tell I was an ELA teacher? So it's, again, it's not changing the ultimate goal. If what that assessment is or whatever that standard is has completely changed for that student, you're now talking about a content modification. But that's a very good question. And it's also helpful for teachers to engage in practices where they examine questions. Like if a test is being accommodated or you're putting differentiation in place, do that pulse check to say, like, are we actually changing this? Like, what is going on? And lucky for you, we're gonna have a process to show you to help you with that. So that's content. And that is a worthwhile place to spend some time because, again, as Sarah said, it is often misunderstood and misinterpreted. So second area is process. And this is how learning is structured. So with here, like the guiding question we like to have in mind is there a practice or set of approaches that are more effective for this student when building knowledge and or skills? So for example, that can look like, is this student actually going to be leveraging a graphic organizer to complete this assignment? Are they going to be using like a checklist to answer this math question or something like that? It's how are they leveraging different process supports to still meet that end goal of grade level expectations? And then third is in product, and that is what is produced and what is assessed. And so the question there is, are multiple options provided for students to demonstrate their learning? So this could be, is that student answering it on paper? Are they dictating it to someone? Are they having some other means of demonstrating their proficiency in a given area outside of what may be like a traditional approach of like a pen and paper assessment?
I also want to jump in and say, I think this one's my favorite one because I feel like it's underrated. And it was really obvious during remote, when schools went remote, that gathering information about what a child knows was really hard to do for a lot of folks over Zoom. And so that's where you got a lot of really creative thinking around like using sort of different technical, like different tools like Nearpod or Jamboards, right? I think we started to think more broadly of how are we going to understand that what these students are learning. And now that we're moving back into the classroom, we have to take that sort of lens and also really think critically about providing options for students to demonstrate their learning in ways that actually are strengths-based, right? We're saying we want you to show us that you've learned, as opposed to how can I figure out what you didn't learn, right? And so I think that's a lens shift that's helpful to point out. And also something like that product piece is critical and as I said, underrated, because I think sometimes we forget to look at that.
Yes. That fourth one that I referenced was like, and sometimes people consider a fourth one, is environment. And I think there are like differing schools of thought on this, but SDI in consideration of environment might be having a student have reduced distractions, having them be able to take something in a separate location. All of those pieces could be considered, especially design instruction, to remove the barrier if that is a barrier that is presented as a result of that student's disability. Now, as we were just talking about, there are some things that you want to ask yourself as you're thinking through SDI and some questions you can have in mind to guide your planning. So that led our team to develop what we call our SDI Decision Tree. We're very proud of this. The graphic and everything is very well put together. Shout out to our Dynamo CEO and her brilliant visual thinking. So the SDI decision tree is designed to have like 4 concrete steps to guide educators through in planning a lesson that incorporates specialized instruction and intentional differentiation. You'll hear us use this word differentiation, and I want to pause for a second and speak to this a little bit. SDI, when we talk about SDI, it is specifically in regards to students receiving special education services. Differentiation is a strategy that is similar to SDI, with the exception that like it's not necessary for a student to receive special education services, and you might differentiate for groups or clusters of students. Whereas for SDI, you're really thinking of the intention of that student and their disabilities impact on their learning. So there are 4 steps here, as I mentioned. The first one goes right to that access to the general education curriculum, and it's to identify what your unit focus and lesson instructional outcomes are. If our goal is to give students access to this, we need to know what it is. And as a special education teacher, I can tell you there were many times I could walk into a lesson and be like, I don't even know what is the end goal today. I need to know that what I'm doing is actually going to help. So the questions we have folks keep in mind: 1, what are the grade level foci and lesson objectives? When students leave this room today, what is it that they need to have learned? 2nd, how is whole class instruction being designed? This is another critical piece, because you want to know, you don't necessarily want to go create a whole new thing that's not in consideration of how the whole class is engaging in instruction. Because it could be the case that something is very well differentiated and requires just a little bit of work to be SDI for a student. But you want to be thoughtful about how their general education peers are engaging with that content. And 3, have you collaborated with other educators as needed? I used to co-teach chemistry. I will never forget stoichiometry, not because I know what it is so well, but because when I heard the word, I wanted to fall through the floor. And if I did not collaborate with the chemistry teacher, I would really not have been as helpful to my students, because again, I needed to know, what is the end goal here and what are they supposed to be able to do? Oh, okay, now I can put some stuff in place. So very sound step, lean into this one, ask all the questions. It can be really easy to be intimidated if you feel like, well, I don't know this content well enough. And I actually think sometimes that can be an asset, right? Because I need to be able to understand this to help a student understand it. And so being able to spend time here is really helpful and meaningful. Second, Sarah, please jump in at any time to add some points. Step 2 is now restart to identify your student's instructional entry point. So we have a lay of the land. We know what the general education expectation is. Now we think about, does the student have IEP goals that are related to these instructional outcomes? 2, what are the student's strengths and needs related to this unit focus? This is where like present levels are your best friend, because this is where I can go into a student's IEP or IEP at a glance and get a sense of what are the areas that they do really well in and what are the areas that they may need support. This is helpful if even thinking about how Sarah just described how we view student progress. Oftentimes, I think what can happen is we think about where our students are going to struggle mightily, and we can unconsciously miss that they have a ton of strengths. And so let's think about what their strengths are connected to this given area and how we can leverage that as an access point for them. And then the third one is, do the students' needs create significant barriers to accessing that grade level content? What is at play? What's happening? And is the impact of their disability so significant in this area that they are requiring SDI? And if so, what is it? Because we also don't want to almost over accommodate, if you will. We want to make sure we're removing barriers without removing like rigor necessarily, like removing the grade level expectations. So again, worthwhile practice to engage in this work with a colleague and dig into some questions and look at what that student's strengths and needs truly are. Step 3 is about actually implementing the necessary instructional adaptations. This is where you make that decision. Is this a content, a process, or a product? SDI approach. Remembering that content is that less than 10% of the population, and thinking through what is this student going to need in process and or product in order to successfully access this curriculum. Step 4 might be one of the things we are probably the most proud of in this whole decision tree. because it's incredibly necessary. This is that gut check. This is your final equity check. And this is all about asking yourself, does the specialized instruction of the SDI that we've planned, one, facilitate independence, problem solving, and or confidence for the learner? If I step into my high school teacher, put that hat on, it was incredibly important. If I had students in 10th and 11th grade, we needed to know that we were supporting them in a way that they could begin to advocate for themselves and better understand what their needs are and communicate those to others. So as we plan for students, we want to make sure that we're doing the same thing from K to 12. Second is, does the SDI maintain the appropriate level of rigor for the learning outcomes and actively engage the learner in meaningful tasks that are aligned to that of their grade level peers? For example, if their peers are reading a 4th grade level text, if that student has a picture book, does that maintain the level of rigor? Does it align to their needs? And is it actively engaging them in a meaningful task? It's a very necessary gut check to make. Does the SDI facilitate student relationship development and meaningful involvement in the lesson? For example, the student's not working by themselves in a corner. The student won't be completing this task one-on-one with an adult. Do they have an opportunity to actually engage with their general education peers? And, sorry, apologies for that the graphic goes a little bit into that purple bar, but does the SDI address IEP goals and or provide opportunities for monitoring progress towards those goals? This is also a really good question to ask, because don't miss an opportunity to progress monitor. And sometimes we can think that like we have to create all of these new super specific things in order to progress monitor, when you actually have opportunities to collect that data on a regular basis. Is there anything you want to add there?
I think the one thing I will add is that like this is obviously breaking down a process into really bite-sized pieces and steps. And like you may look at this and say like, I can't do this for every one of my students, for every one of my classes, in every one of my lessons, right? But I think what we're trying to do is to help folks build that muscle memory that will then make these kinds of activities more intuitive and easier to follow. And also to sort of demystify a little bit more the process for the gen ed teacher population. So that, you know, because we really believe that general ed teachers and classroom teachers, specials teachers, folks who aren't necessarily special ed teachers can still provide some meaningful tailoring in their lessons. And so if there are steps in here that you think will help you do that, obviously we want to flesh them out and we want to bring them to the surface so that everyone has access to the material around how to do this. And I think that's really where the collaboration can really come into play. If a you know, special ed teacher is really good at like step 3, maybe there are ways in which you can do some planning, like collaborative planning, but like at different times so that everybody's building the same skills. Like I'm envisioning some sort of Google Doc where like, I'm the gen ed teacher, I know I'm doing step 1. And then the special ed teachers like going in and sort of like updating, if you don't have common planning time, for example, updating steps 2 and 3. And then maybe like right before the lesson, you're just like connecting and saying like, let's just do this equity check together.
And if you are asking yourself right now, well, ABC, why don't you put something together like that? We're thinking the same thing. It is definitely something in the works. We recognize that this is an area that folks would really appreciate more materials and resources. And so we want to continue to build them out as we go. In that vein, something that we do every month is we pull together some of these frequently asked questions. Again, because we're doing this work in the field with partners, we have an opportunity to start to pick up some trends that come up as people engage with the resources. As we go through the FAQs, again, please feel free to drop anything in the comments. I keep saying pop on the mic, but I think folks are a little shy, and that's okay. So keep dropping things in the comments in the chat. So the first FAQ, this connects very much to what Sarah just said, and it's because we hear it all the time. This is a lot of work for daily lessons. How can I do this in a sustainable way? We know teachers already work incredibly hard. And as Sarah was just speaking to, looking at that process can feel like, well, how do I do this every single day? We actually engaged in some planning sessions with partners, and they were rich and they had some thoughtful discussions. And when we all ended, they were like, I can't do this every day. Valid point. So some of the recommendations we have, one is to keep it unit level, right? Consider your long-term curriculum maps and unit plans. Step one is all about getting clear on what the grade level expectations are and how students are going to engage in the learning. You can do that at a unit level and still plan some more high level strategies. And then you want to identify high leverage strategies that you can apply across that unit. Okay, so for example, if students are, I keep leaning into English teacher things, if students are writing a paper, right, and they're engaging in research and they're having some discussion with peers, I can start to pull some resources and supports for my students that can be applied at various points throughout this unit, knowing the type of learning they're going to be engaged in. Also, you'll begin to establish a bank of what I like to call like low prep strategies that can be leveraged during daily lessons. And so this can be anything from popping in like sentence starters into a paper, or putting together a quick checklist for a student as they complete a multi-step problem, right? Like some of the more spontaneous type strategies that are helpful. Again, like as you build this muscle memory. So it may feel like a lot at the beginning, find unit level places to do this, but as you go, know that you will start to have a lot more things in your back pocket, as I like to say, to call on.
Yeah, I think also just like the other way to do it is to set some regular times to reflect on, like to actually go backwards and say what was working about what we were doing and what wasn't, and think about how, like, if you're doing a monthly reflection, say how you might sort of build upon what worked and what didn't work for different students, how you might build on some of that going forward. So you're taking like bite-sized chunks and you're saying, oh, when we use those sentence starters, it really worked for this child. Like, I'm going to actually offer that to everyone going forward to see if maybe that's a thing that might help other students, right? And so that process, I think, of just spending some time reflecting, whether it's before or after you use these strategies, can help just sort of build that muscle memory a little bit more. So that by the end of the year, you know exactly what strategies are going to work for which students. Ideally. Yeah. Unless they grow and learn, which they do.
They do. And they keep you on your toes. Then they get to a point where they can tell you, hey, this thing actually really works well. Can we try it? Yeah. Question 2. As a general education teacher, how would I use this? Isn't it meant for special education? We often hear this question, and I think it sometimes has a little piece of like, I don't think I know how to do this because I'm not a special education teacher. So yeah, I'm a little bit intimidated maybe. The reality is, as we mentioned earlier, even when we were talking about SDI and differentiation, effective, specially designed instruction, yes, it is planned for a particular student and their needs, but it can be made available to other students, and you may find that it is beneficial for other students because, again, we're not compromising the level of rigor, we're not compromising the grade level expectation, we're removing barriers that are put in place as a result of a student's disability. And so you may find that that is also beneficial to other students in your classroom to support them with accessing and becoming proficient in that grade level content. I think like if there's one thing that I would hope folks will walk away with today, it is that we are maintaining rigor and we are preserving access to the general education curriculum. And if those two things hold constant and you consider the barriers for a student, it can be applicable beyond just the student for whom you're planning. Anything you'd add there, Sarah?
I think it just keeps bringing up for me like choice, right? Like, if you can figure out a way to offer controlled choice, depending on the age of the students, in like those ways of showing what they know, right? It's a perfect way of saying like, you can do X or Y to show me that you learned this thing. Like, to me, that's an awesome way of specially designing instruction for all students, right? Because then you're really saying you pick which one works best for you. And sometimes that can be a helpful approach.
I haven't seen anything come up. I think folks might be just digesting the decision tree. But I'll leave space for any questions. And remember, you can always reach out to us directly if you have any. It's a little bit of a dense topic to really process. Now put our takeaway up here. Again, please, if you have a question that pops up, feel free, but I want to honor processing time as well. So we like to leave you with a little nugget to remember. Effective SDI is both a skill and a mindset. It requires teachers to believe to their core that students with disabilities can learn just as much as their peers, and to know how to drill into what a student actually needs in order to access content. You can do it, and your kids can do it. It just takes a little bit of some strategies and a commitment to making sure it happens. Next month, we will be back. Same place, same time, different date. But next month, we are releasing our blog on understanding the functions of behavior. It's another hot topic that came up. We heard a lot from folks. We're learning a lot with our partners. The blog and the tool are coming soon, so stay tuned for that. And our office hours will take place on November 22nd at 4:30. So again, stay tuned, keep your eye out for our blog, the newsletter, all those things. If you have not signed up for the newsletter, please make sure that you do. We would love to be able to share with you more of what's happening in the world of ABC. And as always, we appreciate any feedback just to help us continue to improve and make sure that we are really meeting the needs that's happening out in the world. That is our ultimate goal, is to make sure that we are building resources and putting things out into the world and giving folks access to different resources that exist in order to build those authentically inclusive schools and communities. Thank you all for joining us. Have a wonderful afternoon, and we will see you next month.